some participants here. Everybody out there in cyber world, I wish you all a good morning. I hope you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. We've got some great panelists here for our discussion of world building. So our panelists, and I'm just looking on my own computer screen, Shaun Hamill, whose book, The Cosmology of Monsters, has earned great praise from Stephen King. Robert Gwaltney, his novel, The Cicada Tree, which is magical realism. Hite, whose short story collection, the Story Catcher, is set in the Depression era South. And Gilly Segal, whose New York Times best-selling novel, YA novel, I'm Not Dying With You Tonight, is set, I guess, in sort of current day Atlanta. So guys, I'm pleased with such a diversity of genres. I mentioned this when we were chatting beforehand. They asked me if I can set it to gallery view. How do I do that? Tell me, I'm sorry, I was born in a different century, so I'm sort of ignorant. I see gallery view. Can everybody else see it that way?
Yes. Well,
yes,
I can.
I'm on gallery currently.
I can see it as gallery view, so that's what I've got.
Gallery.
Any case, when I saw, okay, it says they can only see me. Tell me, Benji, how do I? Oh, now you can. Okay, so apparently it was fixed. Thank you. I was saying though that I was pleased with the diversity. When I hear world building, what leaps to my mind is, high concept science fiction, and certainly we've got some speculative fiction and some magical realism here, but we've also got realism set in the historical present or the historical past. And it turns out, I don't think that's a surprise to anybody who's worked in fiction, that world building is just as important there as anywhere else. So I'm just going to start with a round robin, and panelists, please, if someone says something that provokes you or raises a thought, feel free to interrupt and chime in at any point. But I'll start with round robin just to say, what is your process for world building? Research or whatever you do. And just looking on my own screen, Shaun, how do you go about creating the world that you're going to portray?
For me, it's usually a process of it's half planning, half discovery. So, what I do is I ask questions. Usually I'll have like an image or an idea for something that I want to have happen in the story. And so I start asking myself questions about like, okay, well, what does that mean? Where does it come from? How does it look? And I try to sort of pursue that line of questioning. I would say the world building in my work isn't as, you mentioned Dune in our conversation before, it's nowhere near as extensive as that. It's more like trying to sketch in enough detail to imply sort of this much bigger world, while also making sense within the context of the story that this could be happening, if that makes sense. So it's sort of 6 of one and a half a dozen of the other, if that makes sense.
I think it does. There's a couple of things you mentioned I want to come back to, so I'm just going to say them out loud. I was interested in the idea that you want to sketch in enough. It doesn't have to be comprehensive and global. For my own taste, I get impatient if there's too much description of a world. I want to have a feeling of it. I want to get a sense of it. I feel present in it. And I'm also interested in the idea that it's felt like you're looking for rules that your world operates by. And so, Robert, by chance, you're my next person. I know from a conversation beforehand that you're working on a novel, but do tell us about the Cicada Tree. In magical realism, it feels to me like part of the thing is, and Gilly, we're going to touch on this when we get to you too. So heads up. It feels like part of the game is to say, okay, what are the boundaries that circumscribe what is possible in a world where potentially anything could be possible? Would you comment on that? Like, how do you go about setting those parameters?
Sure. Well, so I think, in regards to magical realism, really, it's just the seemingly the world that we know with elements of magical realism woven in. And I think a good example of that might be like, the Harry Potter. It's in the real world, but then you've got this world of sorcery and wizardry mixed in. For me, the Cicada Tree is set, in 1956 in the mid-century South, pre-civil rights. So for me, so that is from a historical perspective accurate. But for me, I really do. First of all, the South, and Ann and I spoke of this yesterday. We believe that place is certainly a character of the South, and Southern fiction is always going to be a character. Specifically for me, I think that when you're world building, you're going to want to consider, the morality of the place, the culture of the place, because all of those things are going to ramp up tension and conflict in your story. Specifically in the cicada tree, I sort of built this cicada mythology. So there's this sense that, and everyone in the South knows cicadas. So I took that realistic element in nature in the South, and there's this sense that the nymphs live beneath the surface. They're listening for years and years, and they're eating people's secrets, and until the point at which, they're bursting forth. They make their way to the surface. They sing out what they know, telling those secrets and righting wrongs. So that's sort of an example of how I incorporated world building into the cicada tree.
Very cool. And Ann, your short story collection is set in the Depression era South. And
Well, this no,
I beg your pardon.
Hates on Black Mountain is
Oh.
my new, and it's the short story collection. It's set from 1800 to the present because it's
Okay.
because of short stories, and it's covering several generations,
So
and they interconnect.
So tell us about your world building in a world that, in some sense, exists, but you've still got to portray it fictionally. How do you go about collecting that data and using it?
Oh, well, with Black Mountain, is a real place in western North Carolina. I'll get it right in a minute. But I have a mountain in western North Carolina. It's actually a village at the bottom of the Black Mountains, but I created a mountain that collects souls. That's what it's known for. So it's definitely it's definitely a character in all of my books. It started with Ghost on Black Mountain, which is my very first novel, and it started with that. And I had to really research the time era. So even with this book, because I'm going in different generations, I had to think about Black Mountain in different generations. What's it like now? What was it like in 1830? The first story is set in 1830. So I had to really think about that. The Depression era, of course, I knew really well because I had researched it for other Black Mountain novels. And that's really where I built Black Mountain. But with this book, I had to go a little further and think outside of just that Depression era. So for me, I would think, okay, how different was it when the main character of these short story collections that keeps coming back as a ghost is Polly Murphy, and she's a Cherokee, and she's in 1830, and she's actually based on my second great grandmother. And I had to think about how things would be different on Black Mountain from the Depression era, and how many people were there, how many natives were, Native Americans were up there, that kind of thing. So, it's part of it just imagination, but other parts research. I pulled out and I love research anyway. It's a good excuse not to write, right? So you find out all these things that you're not going to use, but hey, they're cool. And that's kind of how I worked with the short stories. So it was a little more of a challenge to write the short stories than it was a novel. And I wanted it to feel like a novel, even though it was short stories. And so that was even more important. It was so important. I didn't tell anybody that's what I was doing because I was afraid that I didn't do it. And then people would say, well, she says it's this, but it really doesn't hook together. So, yeah.
So when you're researching, how do you distinguish between the parts that are going to make it onto the page, or at least into your background, and the parts that are just going to be dross?
Well, I just saturate myself with, like, I'll take the Depression era. and I just saturated myself with it. Now, my grandmother raised me, and she lived through the Depression in Appalachia. So for a long time when I was a kid, I thought, did I live in the Depression? Because she would talk. I mean, it came to supper with us every night. Everything she taught me was based on something she learned from being in the Depression era in Appalachia. She lost her home and things like that. So, I just saturated myself with it and really thought about it, so that when I wrote just the natural things, you just really have to know it. And to do that, you have to research, you have to read, you have to think about, they didn't have air conditioning. So when it got hot, thank goodness they were in the mountains, but still, it can get really hot up there too. And they didn't have the luxuries we have now. And we don't even think about it being luxury. So it was that kind of thing, giving it some thought. I even tried and played around with, going without air for a week, which lasted one day. So, that didn't last at all. I didn't sleep that night. I just did the day, and it was like, no, I'm not doing this. But, when they cooked, they had to use everything from scratch. They had nothing convenient, and that was a real eye opener for me, because I'm not much of a cook. So I had to really do, a lot of research on it. So it's that kind of thing. And then when I sit down to actually write, it just naturally comes, because I've, learned it so well that most of the time I don't have to go back and change it.
Right. You've given us a plethora of things to consider. I love this idea. I think this is true for everybody, that you write out of overflow.
Yeah.
And Gilly, you're actually working in two very different modes. So your YA novel is set in the historical present, which is really, I think, maybe the greatest challenge of all to write in, because you're so close to it. It's hard to see it very clearly. Tell us, and also you work collaboratively, I can't say the word, collaboratively on that novel. So what was your process, and how much, was there much of a tug of war between you and your co-writer?
Oh, that's a great question. So yes, my two YA novels are co-authored with Kimberly Jones. And they are set in the present day, sort of contemporary realistic fiction, loosely based on Atlanta. The first novel is set in East Atlanta, a fictionalized version of East Atlanta, kind of between Alonzo Crim High School and the East Atlanta Village. And the second one is the suburbs of Atlanta. And we actually walked the neighborhood. The very first thing we did was park at Crim High School on a Saturday and walk from there kind of down to the village, and looked around and said, what would our characters see? Who would they interact with? What's in this neighborhood? There's a tire shop on that corner. There's a coffee shop here. There's an empty lot and a big stretch. And actually that original walk really informed the plot for us, because it was, what would you realistically see in this area? And who would you run into? And also, what wouldn't you see, and who wouldn't you interact with? And then that's sort of the path that the girls follow along during the night. And it was, we also then sort of spent, it's realistic fiction. It takes place during a riot. The girls interact both with riot survivors. They are riot survivors, and they also interact with law enforcement. And so we kind of interviewed people who had lived through the riots in Ferguson and in Maryland, and as far back as the 60s, the Philadelphia riots, LA riots. We worked with law enforcement. We actually sort of had this like janky little yellow legal pad sketch of the route that we had mapped out. And I had the opportunity to interview some SWAT officers, and the first thing they said to me was, "Where's your map?" And so I pull out this embarrassing piece of paper, and I'm like, "Here it is." And they spent 2 hours with us talking about where they would stage and what would be happening and what would be necessary in the town. What are the other events that would need to occur for something to become the kind of riot that we wanted to describe? So we kind of world built pretty extensively for that. It's loosely based on a real neighborhood. We fictionalized things, for the purpose of plot, right? We had to have the girls interact with people that might not actually be in East Atlanta, but so sometimes you get to mix. That's the fun of fiction. Fiction is like pie dough, right? You can stretch it as far as you want. You can roll it out and stretch it as far as you want, as long as you don't punch holes in it, because then your filling is going to leak out. So.
Right. You need some boundaries. And we're going to touch on that with your other genre that you work in. But how, Anne sort of brought up this idea of overflow. How much excess did you need before you felt prepared to actually begin a draft?
So I think a lot like Anne, I need a lot. I need to feel like you could drop me into the world that I'm writing in or the neighborhood that I'm writing in. And I'm actually working on another project right now. It's historical in nature. I can't put any words down on the page until I can imagine myself there, right? So I need a lot of excess and overflow, most of which will never be on the page, right? There's a tremendous amount from those 2 hours that we spent with the SWAT officers that is nowhere near the book. But until I understood where they would be and what the radio would sound like and what's the call and what's that I personally couldn't put words to page. That's not that every writer couldn't do the same, but I needed all that. Some of it does. You're surprised sometimes by what does make it on the page. So there are section headings in our first novel, I'm Not Dying With You Tonight, that are actually the police terminology for a riot. So sometimes it surprises you what ends up in there, but a lot of times it's really just about making sure that you feel like you have the tools that you need to start putting those words on the page.
Yeah, I think the great joy of researching for fiction as opposed to other things is, at least for me, it's like you don't actually know what you're looking for, but you have a faith that when you spot it, you'll know what it is. And that's what it is. So you're also working you're writing a novel, or you have a novel rather, set in the Marvel universe. And this is a world which has already been defined. It is very constrained. And you spoke earlier about some of the challenges of that. Tell us about working within a world that is already prepackaged for you, and you must obey those constraints.
Yeah, that was fun and harder than I thought it was going to be, right? So it's science fiction, obviously speculative fiction, maybe it's kind of genre defying. There's some fantasy elements to Marvel. And I went into I'm a fan of the movie universe and also the comics universe, and they are two separate universes, by the way. Different things are happening in them, and different people are alive and dead. But I went into it sort of imagining there were no limits on what I could create. And I am writing a little bit of a techno thriller for Carol Danvers. And I imagined that I could set it partially in outer space and have this, human technology virus infect alien technology. And I put this whole, outline together with Marvel. It's a very formulaic process, right? You have to put forth an outline and they have to approve it before you can actually start writing. And I send this off proudly to Marvel, and it comes back with notes from a guy, and they're brilliant storytellers. So this was actually sort of truly an honor and a learning experience, but it comes back with some very harsh notes going, that's not how technology works in the Marvel world. And I wanted to say, guys, they shoot lasers out of their hands. Surely I could make this up too. But no, I could not. And ultimately, in discussion with them, what I really learned was that's that Pido thing, right? I was stretching that in this universe, the Pido doesn't stretch this way. I've punched a hole, filling is leaking out. Their other plot, they have to worry about the totality of their world, and I only have to worry about my one little novel. And so for them, the answer is you can't punch a hole in the Pido so big that the filling of other stuff starts leaking out. So they do, and it's not realistic, obviously. They shoot lasers out of their hands. So it's not that it's realistic, it's just that it has to have plausible limitations so that someone doesn't find themselves in the middle of my novel going, that's not how anything works anywhere else. Why is this the one place that it works that way?
Right. And there's a difference, between realistic and that great literary term verisimilitude. Something like the cicada tree or the cosmology of monsters has a verisimilitude because it operates fairly within its own set of rules. But there is a set of rules, and the reader, to some level, grasps them. I was interested, Gilly, that you talked about having to have, or at least a map, like a physical map. And in novels I've written, every time, frankly, I usually work with neighborhoods I either live in or have lived in that I know intimately. But like you, I want to know, how far do I walk to the nearest grocery store? What will the grocery store be? Is there a college nearby? What is the neighborhood like? And physical distances. I need to draw it sometimes to scale or print it off if I have to. I wonder for each of you, what are things you do that actually can't appear in print? I guess actually, though, a lot of books have maps in them. Do you draw maps? Do you do drawings of things? What do you do? Shaun, tell us about that.
So for cosmology, I didn't draw any maps, but I mean, the world in cosmology, specifically the secondary world, the magic side of the world is it rearranges itself. So it would have been really tough to do a map of that. Like it kind of, that's kind of one of its features, is that it rearranges based on who's in it and what it is trying to show that person. And also to prevent escape, So there wasn't really a lot of mapping that I could do there. For the novel that I'm in edits on now, it is set in a small town. So I did map out that town, to help me get a feel for it, because it wasn't based on my hometown. It was, an entirely new creation. So I needed to know, like, okay, well, where's the park? Where are the woods? All of these locations that the characters are frequenting. So I did do, just, very, very basic, like I wouldn't show it to anybody or anything, but it did definitely help me bring a level of verisimilitude to that town. But again, as far as the magical elements go, I didn't map them, although I guess I could have in this case. And who knows, maybe I will. We're not done with edits yet, so there may be an opportunity there for a little bit more structure.
So how did you create this, for lack of a better word, we'll call it a tourist attraction? Like, how did you formulate that? What that would be? The description of a novel sort of reminds me of Swamplandia in some ways. How did you create that?
So for that, what I did, rather than drawing that out, was I wrote my way through it. Essentially, there is a scene not early on, but about a third of the way through the book, where the narrator, who's 6 years old at the time the attraction opens, and has not been allowed to take part in it because his mom's like, it's too scary, you're not old enough. He ends up in there exploring it on his own. And so basically that was how I built it out, was what is he seeing the first time he actually goes through it. Like, there are things that you hear about from other characters, but you actually get the layout of the attraction from him in that scene. And that's how I do a lot of my world building, to be honest, rather than mapping, is writing my way through locations, especially locations where the mood is going to be a little bit more horror centric, or I'm trying to sort of invoke a sense of dark wonder. Is I'm looking for what's going to be the most interesting thing the character could see right now, what's going to interest me, what's going to pull me forward into the story. And I may go back and massage that or rearrange things if I come up with a better idea and put it too soon. I may push that back a little bit, but usually that's how I find my way through, is I literally go exploring in prose.
So how much of this exploration ends up in the finished manuscript? Again, is it a matter of overflow?
It is a matter of overflow. Yeah. In particular, that scene where the narrator is going through that haunted house got cut back a lot. Like, there was an insane amount of detail, so much so that both my agent in early drafts and then my editor in later drafts were like, I'm losing the thread of the story here. Like, this, you got to keep the kid moving. Like, you need to be sketching, not painting here. And so, but it was incredibly helpful for me to have all of that. And it's the same thing with the invented world too, is there was a lot more rules, a lot more mythology than ever made it onto the page. We ended up pulling that back because we thought the mystery was more important to preserve than trying to outline, like, okay, here's exactly how this works. Like, it didn't really matter for the characters' journeys. It mattered for me to know, like, can these creatures do this or not? Can this happen in this world or not? But it's not something that the reader necessarily needed. And it preserved a sort of sense of mystery. So, like, there's world building, but there's also like sort of world obscuring kind of going on in that book, deliberately.
Right. So it's sort of you're peeling an onion and you slowly discover, the reader slowly discovers this thing. One of the themes that's emerging from this panel is, which is, I guess, not a surprise, is the writer, the author needs a lot more information than will be presented to the reader. And you need to have a thorough sense of authority, which may only be hinted at in your finished manuscript. So Robert, how do you go about building a world? Are you a map maker? Perhaps that's not relevant to everybody. Or what do you do?
I believe there are two types of writers. I think there are writers that write from a place of emotion, and there are writers that write from a place of intellect. Both of them equally as wonderful. I'm an emotional writer, very visual writer. So I think one of the tools that I used was sort of having an image board. So I collected images. For example, one of the things, Cordelia Mayfield, who's the matriarch of the Mayfield family, wears Christian Dior. So I did a lot of research about 1956 fashions and Christian Dior. So just a lot of visual depictions of arresting images. But music was also very important in my process. I obsessively listened to, I have a little soundtrack for the book. So I do a playlist, things that I would listen to over and over to help evoke emotion in the world that I was writing. So I used, so Moonlight Sonata, I listened to over and over again. And there are 3 movements to Moonlight Sonata. I think Adagio, Allegretto, and Presto. And there are 3 acts to the cicada tree. So I tried to, from a pacing perspective, try to align each act with the movement. And within the novel, and music plays a huge part of the book. So there is something called Cordelia Sonata, and it is an engagement gift that's given to Cordelia by her husband prior to them being married. And so when I reference Cordelia Sonata, actually what I'm referencing is Moonlight Sonata. But there's also within this world the elements of magical realism. It really is a story about women, and each of them has something remarkable about them. So, for instance, the summer of 1956, Annalise Newell, who was the protagonist, who was a piano prodigy, I took it's the summer that she first tastes music, and it's the summer that she first sees music. So I took the condition of synesthesia, and I gave it a supernatural spin. So that's an example of how I implemented magical realism into the world of Providence, Georgia.
I see some nods from Gilly and Ann, so I'd be interested to hear if you listen to music or how music informs your world building. One of the things I've noticed too about all of you is that the world you build, how do I say this, has got to be particular to the theme and the mood of your fiction. Obviously, for practical purposes, the taking a knee has no relevance outside of a certain era, or would have a different relevance. But also the placement in a city like Atlanta, which is troubled and complicated history around race and moods and so forth. So Ann, I'm going to pose you a double question. And yeah, sorry, life's hard for Ann Hite.
A twofer.
Yeah, maybe a 3-part question. Here's a 50-part question. Part 1A. First, like, what do you do that might be, I'm curious about mapping and other things that help you visualize. And also, are there any other things you do to help you establish a deep sense of the mood of your place? So, for example, listening to music. And if so, what do you listen to when you write? Okay,
let me get something real quick. Hold
Sure.
on.
Let's talk about her while she's gone.
Here, I'm right here. My husband's an artist, so I needed to know, since I created Black Mountain itself, I needed to know, and that's how it started. This particular map. So I told him I need a map, and this is what I need to see where these houses are. And him being an artist, it wasn't simple, and I love it. And this was from my book, Where the Soul.
That's charming.
And I was able to look at it and go through it and think about where everybody was situated, how they'd come up the mountain, how they get, and then I framed it because he did it such a good job. You know, it's great. And we give them away at my book launch.
Nice.
He signed, you know, signed copies, signed and numbered. Yeah. So that's
charming.
I'm fortunate to have a husband that would take the time as an artist and do the mapping for me. And it really helps because I would go back and say, okay, I'd have a digital file because I had to send the publisher a digital file, and I'd pull it up on my computer and be working on another computer and sit and look at it and think about, okay, they're coming up the mountain. This is what's going to happen. They're in these woods, you know, and I could imagine things that aren't actually there, you know, on that particular map, but I could see them in my head because of that. I know it's kind of sounds weird, but it was very helpful. And then music is a very big part of how I work to evoke emotion in my work. I listen to I do too have a playlist, but mine are all my favorite kind of music. So if I'm working on a really sad or emotional particular part, you know, fearful, I have a set of songs that I would listen to. Most of them are set in the 70s and the 60s. They were recorded in the 70s and the 60s. Very, you know, a lot of Neil Young.
Give us a couple of titles.
Yeah, and Neil Young's Harvest Home, that whole album I listen to. I'm gonna, you know, I'm a very big old classic rock person. a lot of Layla, the old album from Eric Clapton and Layla, where he was Derek and the Dominoes. I listened to that. There was one point where I listened to the soundtrack from Cold Mountain because there's a lot of really mournful, moody songs in that, and so that helps. So when I hear a song, I know it'll hit me in the gut. I know, okay, that's a song I need to get. I get it, and I put it away in a certain category. Okay, this one's, you know, mad. This is, you know, that kind of thing, and I put it there to pull on later. So, but music is hugely a big part of how I write, you know, and it doesn't matter that they're singing because I've had 4 kids. I cannot listen to the actual words. It doesn't.
You're used to ignoring words.
I can just ignore it, and I can just hear the, you know, it doesn't mess with my head to actually write and hear lyrics in the background because I've learned how to do that kind of stuff anyway. So, you know.
I'm gonna move to Gilly, but just by a show of hands, how many of you listen to music while you write? Raise your hand. So everybody does. That's interesting. So Gilly, tell us about you. What is the music you listen to specifically? And I assume you would listen to different music in different genres. So tell us about that.
I do, yeah. So when I can, I work a full-time day job and I have kids. And so I do what's called writing in the cracks, which means when I have a free 20 or 30 minutes, I'm writing something. Sometimes it's just in the notes app on my phone. So I don't always have the luxury of like sitting down and putting in the earbuds and listening. But when I do, words sometimes bother me when I'm writing. The words get in my head. So I'm a big fan of instrumental music, like the Carol Danvers writing soundtrack was epic movie soundtracks, right? So like, you know, the Marvel movies and all of the sort of big action adventure movies, you just go on Spotify and I'm not very creative about this part of like, epic movie soundtracks is my search term. So that was that. And then I write for young people. However, I am not a young person, shocker. And so oftentimes the music that I would go to set the mood or the vibe for myself, I know is not what teenagers are actually listening to. So when I have to create playlists, and you can actually find these on my website as well as our map, by the way, I turn the reins over to my daughter who is 15. And I'm like, what would the children be listening to here?
That's good. Yeah.
My co-author's son is a year older. So like our children did the playlists for the YA novels.
So what was that like? Did you discover things that you thought this is actually quite good, or did it, you know?
No, it's really great. It takes you back to your own youth, right? Like my dog, she would kill me if she heard me right now. She's at that age where she's into like sort of very emotional, sort of like emo female singers. And I had, I had my Sarah McLachlan phase and all that. So it's really fascinating because the more things, and the artists are different, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so it's really fun to get to know what it is that's evoking that for her these days. And I have liked a lot of the artists, right? I've found Alessia Cara that way. And so some of her people have crept onto none of my people have crept onto her playlist. Can't imagine why.
So what do you listen to when you're writing in the Marvel universe?
The movie soundtracks.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah,
of
big
course,
instrumental,
obviously.
big, sort of big brass and sort of dramatic cello sometimes.
Mhm.
I'm imagining people flying around, the tri-state area of New York, and so they've got to have a big soundtrack.
Right. I think, again, a theme that seems to emerge, and this is, when I'm reading fiction, the thing that'll get me is not the detail about how tall the building was or, how many buttons there were on an accordion or anything like that. It's a thing that evokes a sense of how it feels to the character. And I think you all are talking about that, all are talking about that. How, like, what sort of detail are you looking for that with a sentence or a phrase could evoke a sensation of place and character, maybe better, probably a lot better than, 7 paragraphs of careful description. Shaun, what do you, I'm sorry, before I pose this to Shaun, I'm just doing this so rote. I'm just going in the same circle every time, so sue me. Robert used the word synesthesia, and I think in a way that's what everybody's trying to accomplish. With just the words, I want to get a sense of this, this multiple senses that we experience with a familiar fragrance or a favorite old tune or anything like that. So, Shaun, what sort of details do you think really evoke a world for a reader?
I mean, it depends on the type of world you're trying to evoke, right? I tend to focus, it depends on where I'm at, right? Like in Cosmology of Monsters, in the secondary world, the world of the monsters, like there's a lot of time spent describing landscape, buildings, but also like the quality of the air, the sky, like being a different color, the smells, things like that. Whereas, whenever I was writing about the suburbs, I didn't worry as much about that because it's sort of everybody's got that shorthand. So it was more about like, okay, well, what's going to make this stand out as 1998 or 1968, depending on what year I was working in. And I didn't do a whole lot to try and evoke it. It was usually just like 1 or 2 well-placed details, like usually something like a movie that the characters would go see. Like in 1968, the characters go to see Rosemary's Baby, like things like that, rather than trying to like really just lay on thick, like, here's the exact model of car, here's the style of jeans, but here are the books that they would have been reading, here are the movies they were going to see, here are the cultural attitudes that would have kind of been prevailing, and then just having my mom go over my dialogue to make sure that I wasn't using any anachronisms. So I don't know that that's a particularly interesting answer, but that's kind of been my shorthand. I'm not, unlike a lot of Southern writers, I don't feel like I've got a great gift for description. I feel like character dialogue, that tends to be more where I shine. So I tend to go lighter on those elements when I can, on descriptive elements, just because I'm not, it doesn't play a huge part in my own internal imagination and world building.
But it still sounds like you're selecting those elements that are going to help establish the mood of your piece. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Robert, same question to you. You talked about the Moonlight Sonata. How do you, in a way, you can't, they don't transcribe to each other, but how do you select details for your world that somehow match those moods that you want to evoke?
Oh gosh. Well, for instance, when we were talking about synesthesia, for like, so say throughout, there would be there's a character, her name is Etta Mae, and she's a 10-year-old Black girl, and she too is a prodigy. She would have what you would call, from an operatic perspective, her voice would be a coloratura soprano. And Annalise suspects that young Etta Mae's singing has the ability to affect the emotions of others and impact the natural world around her. And so when she hears the Etta Mae singing, sometimes the emotion that she's feeling has a taste associated with it. So just figuring out, like, I think there's in the opening, I think in the first chapter, there's a reference to her having the vinegary taste of sadness on her tongue. So just trying to figure out what certain sounds might sound like or look like. What does music look like to young Annalise? And that was the fun aspect of it. Trying to figure out, okay, what do I think sadness might taste like?
Right.
And what does anger look like in music? I don't know if I answered your question, man.
No, I think you did. I think the what you want to do as a writer is, and in world building and in characterization is to, readers want to experience something they haven't yet. Even if I'm revisiting a world that I think I know, like current day Atlanta, I want to see it in a way that's fresh and surprising to me. So I think that's what you're on about. I completely endorse it. And what are your thoughts on that? You've actually addressed this to some extent, but what are some things you do and what are you looking for in terms of detail that are evocative rather than merely descriptive?
Well, for me, nature is a big deal. I do a lot of hiking. And so in my books, a lot of things take place outside in the forest. And I bring, it's not hard for me to bring that alive because it means so much to me. And if you've ever been up into the mountains and hiked in them, you know that there's just so much to see and how that works. And I make that work with the ghosts, and I make that work with the emotions and how the character views what they're seeing on their walk, or what they're, what's taking place, even in the house or whatever, is from their point of view and what their state of mind is at that time. So the way that they might describe a tree might be horrific because what's going on with them is horrific. And that's just a really poor example, but trying to explain how I do that. So I will look at, I'll take a walk, which you don't have to really force me to do that. I'll go out and hike and just really think about, okay, if she were walking, because in the set of time that I have most of my books in Appalachia, a lot of walking took place, or wagons or horses. They didn't have many cars up there. And so, what does she see? How does she feel at this point in time with what she's going through? And I say she because most of the time my protagonists are female. Not all the time, but most of the time they are. So, and that's just how I do it. And some of it's just natural, and I don't mean to sound, but it just comes to me when I put myself into that place. It just feels right. And I go and I write it, and then I put it away for a little bit and go back and make sure that, I hit where I needed to hit emotionally, because I think that's how you pull your reader in, is those emotions, that they're actually walking through whatever your character's walking through.
Anne's talking about what I call the woo-woo in writing. Those things that we can't quite explain or understand, but they just happen.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't always get that, okay? That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you just have to find, you find your way through it without that. But when it does happen, it's a beautiful thing.
John Gardner has some wonderful exercises, very much what you're talking about. Writing, describing a farm without mentioning the loss from the point of view of the farmer has just lost his child or something like that. And you describe
Right.
the farm without actually mentioning the emotional content. I think, Shaun talked about this novel where the actual location changes. For every character, I think that their perception of the world around them is different depending on what is, what's in front of them emotionally, what their sort of content of their mind is like. So Gilly, years ago, I read there was a Pat Conroy novel set largely in Atlanta. And, I had a little thrill of recognition. Oh, I know that place. I've been there. So when you're dealing with a world that is, familiar to at least to some extent, and it's going to be familiar to at least a large portion of your audience, they're going to think they know it. How do you select the details that are going to surprise the reader in some way, in a gratifying way?
So actually, I think what you do, or what we tried to do, was to select the details that are going to do just that, right? They're going to give you the thrill of going, I know that thing, I recognize that place, or that event that occurred, or that memory, because you can, that creates that sense of familiarity and plausibility, and it builds out this world without having to say too much. I'm also the kind of reader who's like, oh, don't give me 11 pages of description of the town. I don't,
Right.
I'm bored. So I think it's sort of that balance of getting just enough. I also think sometimes it's helpful to think about what triggers the strongest memories in ourselves. And those are the details that can really help build out a scene. And a lot of times it's not the things that are easy for me as a writer to put down. A lot of times I'm describing what would the characters see, but those aren't my strongest memories. My strongest memories are associated with other things, like smell is a really big one, right? So in our book, we're talking about a riot and burning tires. That has a really particular smell, if you've ever smelled it, and your eyes are going to sting. So I think it's some of those details that are what you associate with really strong memories in your own life can help you figure out what are the details to add in that make this feel like a real event that's occurring to your characters and to your readers.
And the Marvel universe is also, ostensibly very well known.
Yeah.
So what can you do within that world that, again, brings a little something surprising and something new, something that only Gilly is going to be able to give us?
Oh, that's a hard one. Yeah, I think that's a lot about actually the emotion, right? This is a weird thing to say about a book that's primarily plot driven, but in particular for Carol Danvers, who in the comics universe at this point is almost an invincible character for my comics readers in the audience. Carol Danvers is incredibly strong. She's almost invincible. How do you threaten a character like that? That was the biggest challenge. And the answer was actually mental, right? Like the only thing you can really do to threaten Carol Danvers is to make her question who she is. And I gave her a villain that, is kind of the reverse of Carol herself, right? So she's sort of, I gave her what I hope is Carol's Moriarty. Because that's, you sort of have to work with what you've got. And I've got Carol Danvers, and there's, you can't shoot lasers at Carol Danvers, and you can't blow her up with a bomb. She's not gonna, there's nothing that will hurt her, but you can threaten her sense of who she is and make her rebuild that.
Very cool. I like the, when you're world building, and again, we'll just do round robin, is there a particular outside sense that you crave? For example, are you trying to get in a fragrance? Like, Gilly, I agree with you. Like, to me, those are the most evocative things. It can completely cast me back decades. Or is there a sound or a texture? Shaun, do you have anything like that that's maybe a specific, or again, a glimpse of the world that is very evocative?
For me, it's usually the quality of the air around the characters that I tend to reach for first. That's my craft move, I guess, to borrow something from one of our panels yesterday. Just what does it actually feel like to exist outside or inside this building or this place? And that, I think that does come from living in the South, where the air quality can vary wildly from day to day or even hour to hour, in terms of humidity or warmth, cold, things like that. So it's not a particularly interesting answer, but it is true for me, I think.
I think air can be, especially again, and I'm a regionalist, so forgive me, but especially in the South where humidity and heat is such a thing. Anne had talked about the fact that to the characters of her fiction, the fact they go to sleep in the summer without air conditioning or perhaps a fan is something that they may actually be unaware of. This is not something they notice particularly. They just turn the pillow over to the other side 20 times a night. And so making us aware of something which maybe we don't really notice, we notice on a very low level of consciousness, sort of bringing that forward. It's literally atmospheric, isn't it? You're making us conscious of the atmosphere. For you, Robert, I have a guess what it'll be. I'll write down my secret answer. I'm going to write my secret answer down. Hold on a second.
Okay.
What do you think is the one sense that you would like to evoke outside of your fiction? If that is a good question.
Well, I think, where I am now as a writer, in Cicada Tree and what I hope to accomplish next and the things that I love in others' writings, tone of emotional tone. And I don't know, I'm drawn to, I'm not a dark person. I mean, I'm fairly happy individual, but I'm drawn to and this tone of the melancholic lonesomeness is what I hope to accomplish, and it's what I'm drawn to. And I think some of that probably goes back to being an outsider growing up in Southwest Georgia, and feeling that lonesomeness. But I do try to evoke that in my writing, and so I think tonally, the tone of the novel I'm very conscious of.
So I'll reveal. I did not get the right answer. I was assuming that it would be Sam.
Say,
but
you
we'll
are
say I was
not
right.
I
did a thing like that.
It's central, but I think for me, the emotional tone of the novel is what's most important to me.
So Anne, what are you trying to evoke especially in the world that you build?
I'm drawn to the darker kind of stories, morbid as I am. I grew up reading Stephen King on a continuous basis. Love that stuff. And we all have dark parts of our lives, and trying to, I grew up in a home with a mother who was mentally ill. She was bipolar before bipolar had been diagnosed, really. And so what you worked real hard at is just helping her look as normal as possible so she could stay in the family rather than having to go somewhere like what we called Milledgeville back then, because there wasn't a lot of, you didn't get a lot of help back then. So that tends to pull me, and I tell that story because it tends to pull me to the darker edge. I want to figure out why people do what they do and make the choices that they make, especially mothers. And recently in an interview, I was asked my mothers are always weak and my grandmothers are strong. And I thought, oh yeah, well, that's probably true. But it's because of my own experience. So a lot of times I'm looking for answers that I don't get, but that I'm looking for, and it resonates with other readers, because we've all been, especially when I get lots of emails saying, wow, you just captured my mom. And that, blows me away, because when you're within something like that, you feel like you're the only person, but yet there's this whole generation of women who had issues, for whatever reason. Historically, we could debate that all day, and so, yeah, for me, it's just about bringing that emotion. When you can capture the emotion in a reader, regardless of what you're, writing about, then you've got them, because it's going to resonate with them, even if it's not the same thing that happened. It's going to resonate with them.
Right. So Gilly, what about you? Go ahead.
I sort of forgot the question, but
Okay,
actually
Go ahead.
I'm gonna pull out a commonality that I think is really interesting from what the other fine authors here have said, which is we're all really ruthless about the details that we include, right? They all serve a purpose of some kind or another. It tells you something about the character, right? I'm going back to Robert's, what does sadness taste like to this character? Well, it's vinegary. I don't know if that would have been my taste of sadness, but it means something to that character. And what do I see on this walk? And what do I, what's in this neighborhood that I'm walking around? Where all of those details serve a purpose. It's might be the most beautiful description in the world, but if it's not telling you something about one of your characters or the plot of the story or the location that they're in, we have all focused on the really meaningful details. So I think it's really interesting to think about being ruthless in the choices that you're making about what details you include versus what details that you exclude. And you exclude sometimes stuff that you love because it isn't actually serving the purpose that you need something to in that moment.
It's definitely fatiguing when an author just wants to display her research, and say, look at all this information I'm going to provide you with. It's like, let's just turn pages so we get to the story again. So the question was how, and maybe I'll rephrase it. I'm going to work counterclockwise for a while. Is how, and I think I have a sense of it, especially with your Marvel work, how you're using your setting to achieve a tone, and what tone are you seeking? And I'm going to modify that and make it real highfalutin. Do you feel that the world you build somehow matches the landscape of the emotional theme of the story? That is a terrible question because it sounds so grand. Go answer it.
So again, in that sort of theme of ruthlessness, I think you used a word before that I really liked earlier in the panel about being an authority, right? You're the authority on this world that you're building. I think you have the opportunity to make the setting work for the tone and the theme of your novel. And that's what I'm trying to do, right? So if I go back to my Marvel novel, Carol is really deeply questioning who she is. I won't spoil it for anyone who's still reading the Carol comics. She's discovered something really dramatically life-shifting about who she really is, and she's grappling with that and struggling with that. And so I had the opportunity to create a setting. I mean, it's New York, but it's a futuristic timeline where technology works in a certain way that further challenges who she thinks she is. And so I set her in this world amongst people who challenge that. And as an author, I think you have the opportunity to use those things to create them the way that you want to move your character. I mean, at the end of the day, these are stories about people and characters. Even a Marvel novel, which is a lot about shooting things with lasers and a lot about, outer space, and a lot about like an aerial battle with, sentient drones. But at the end of the day, and this is something the Marvel people said to me, was like the heart of a good Carol story is blank, right? And it's when you're trying to figure that stuff out, take the characters that you're talking about and go, the heart of a good so-and-so story is blank, and then you use everything else in the novel to further that goal. Right.
I think another commonality that I've seen emerge is world building is so much more than the landscape, and the landscape may well be part of it, but it's the the physical artifacts that the people use. It's the music they're listening to. In some cases, it's their material conditions of life, and it's also the way they view each of those things. Is there something from either of your novels, Gilly, that sort of shows a characteristic way where maybe this young lady would see this at this time? Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think probably in our first novel is the best example of this, right? Because we have two characters, one who is Black and one who is white. And my co-author, by the way, is Black. And this story was intentionally written by co-authors who shared the identity and lived experience of their character, was thinking about how the white character, who's for the first time living in a predominantly Black neighborhood, having come from a predominantly white neighborhood, would be experiencing and understanding these moments. And in order for her to acknowledge her implicit bias bias that she has, right? So it's how would this character view the guys on the corner who are sitting in on sort of an abandoned lot, and they're, you know, smoking dope at the moment. In fact, they're really good and caring people who ultimately help the girls take care of themselves, right? They take care of the girls and they walk them to their next location, and they're really good. But her initial reaction is one that is filled with implicit bias based on assumptions that she's making from what she knew and where she came from, dropped into this environment. So I don't know.
Yeah, it makes me think of that character Boo Radley, you know, who through most of the novel is this kind of terrifying figure. And then, you know, he's a hero.
Yeah.
And we got, guys, this has just been such a wonderful panel. Our time is out, but I'm gonna use you just a little longer. Can we do one quick round robin? I'm gonna go in reverse. Is there a moment you can tell us about where a character sees or perceives something in their world, that interaction between them and the world is somehow emblematic of something? And do you have anything you can share with us? I know I asked tough questions. And after this, we're doing just a little calculus, but just a little. And thank you for your patience, because it's actually past time, but I'm enjoying this conversation so much. I just want this last question off the table.
I think with my characters, they're very strong women, and they always find their strength. They never understand who they are. And I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but they never understand really who they are until they go through the things they go through and find that they are these strong women. They are independent women, you know. So if that makes any sense, that
makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. I love the sort of character that you see has hidden strengths by the end of the story. So Robert, how about you? Is there a moment you can talk about where the characters, and I think to some extent you have mentioned this, the character's perception of the world reveals the character to us?
Well, so there are themes of obsession within the cicada tree, and there's this moment, this peculiar moment where Annalise gets the sense that things might not be what they seem in regards to her perceptions of the Mayfield family. There's this odd exchange between the young Mayfield girl named Marlissa, where she sort of pushes Annalise up against the wall and she speaks. She says this peculiar thing in French, and what she's asking her is, you know, are you afraid of ghosts? And of course, this sort of instills another element of mystery in young Annalise, because how in the heck is she going to figure out what Marlissa just said in French? I mean, who in Providence, Georgia can speak it other than the Mayfield? So I think that's a moment in the book within which she thinks, oh my gosh, you know, Marlissa might be crazy, and I'm even more fascinated now.
Right. So you've got, you know, so the three of you talk about things that are some way unfamiliar to the reader. You know, the men on the corner who may be viewed as threatening, a woman's own inner strength that she hasn't suspected. Here's this French-speaking person asking me questions like, what the hell is going on? Oh, okay, you know, I can't do any French. But Shaun, your challenge is somewhat different, because you're writing about an extraordinary setting that I think the characters themselves, to some extent, would see as perfectly normal. These are growing up in kind of Addams Family circumstances. Is there times you show? Are there times you show, you know, that strange perception of something, not just the thing itself, but the way the character sees it, that delineates the character for us?
Yeah, there are a couple of moments. There are 3 moments in Cosmology of Monsters where the narrator Noah is going through a version of a haunted house, and in each instance it ends in a sort of revelation for him that the world, either his world or the world beyond, you know, the world itself, is not what he thinks it is. So there's always this sense that the world is bigger and stranger and more frightening than he's understood up to this point. And ultimately it's sort of leading him towards this destiny of like, is he going to retreat from that, or is he going to step forward into it and embrace it? And so it really does that sense of seeing or revelation. It's almost a religious revelation. It's just the dark inverse of Paul on the road to Damascus, right? It's the world opening up for him, and having to make a decision and decide who he is in that moment, whether he goes towards it or retreats from it. And his reaction to it varies throughout the book, depending on where he is in his own journey.
Well, folks, thank you so much to our participants who've been listening. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I think our panelists have given us so much to think about and ponder on, and I certainly will be. At this point, there's nothing else to say except goodbye, everybody. Have a great Sunday. And some of you I'll be seeing later in another panel. So take care and so long.
Bye, everybody.